Can a colonial border strip Indigenous communities of their right to protect the rivers that sustain them? That is the core question facing the Supreme Court of British Columbia in Canada. As the country fast-tracks mining operations in the headwaters of the Stikine, Unuk and Taku Rivers, downstream tribes in the Alaska Panhandle face the fallout. Today, we look at how the Southeast Alaska Indigenous Transboundary Commission, or SEITC, is turning to the court to challenge provincial oversight and demand a direct say in decisions shaping their traditional territories.
These mines are a very real threat to the cultural existence that's been going on here for tens of thousands of years, and very effective stewardship that to this day has left a very productive, dynamic, diverse region and forest. This is a global value here, and it's due entirely to the tens of thousands of years of an Indigenous stewardship.
The man you're hearing is Guy Archibald, an analytical environmental chemist and microbiologist with over 20 years of experience, who now, in his role of executive director of SEITC, engages the mining sector to safeguard against environmental disasters and protect water sources.
Here in Southeast Alaska, it is as much water as it is land. Our communities are scattered across islands, inland communities. We are not connected by a road system. We derive at least 80% of our caloric intake from the foods we gather in the water and off the land. There's a saying here that when the tide goes out, the table is set. And it's always been that way. So it's developed this culture of walking softly, taking only what you need, sharing, giving back through ceremony to the land that feeds us.
The Unuk River is so important to our Native people, and not only the Native people, but everybody in line that was down there with their buckets. My name is Cindy Wagner. I am a bona fide member of the Metlakatla Indian community in Annette Island Reserve in Metlakatla, Alaska. I married my husband, Louis, who is the caretaker of the Unuk River by inheritance. One generation to the next, someone picks it up and carries it on. He's the last one so far, but they've been doing that for many, many years before I met him. And I'm new to the river. It's been quite an interesting 56 years with him.
In their community, Cindy and her husband are known as the Grease Lady and the Ooligan Man. Their way of life and the survival of their culture hinges on the ooligan, the Saviour Fish, which their people have sustainably harvested for over 10,000 years. Rich in vital oils, these small, silvery fish serve as a crucial food source not just for humans but for entire local ecosystems, from eagles and grizzlies to seals. For generations, their arrival each March has marked the true beginning of spring.
We have one rule, and that's if we watch the first bunch go by is about 1,500 fish, maybe 2,000 fish. They come in and they leave, and we don't touch them because we call them the scouts. They are the ones who will come in. I guess they check the river out and they leave. And the next day, the day after that, it's just ooligan full force. But we don't ever touch the scouts. And if there's not enough to fish, we sit there and we wait. And it's very difficult sometimes because we also were tendering herring. And that's where our paycheck came from, was packing herring for the fishermen. But we would risk that to come up and check on the ooligan. And we would give it up if the ooligan was there, because that's how important we knew the fish was to the people. When we go to the river, it's so beautifully quiet, and you start listening, and you could start hearing the birds coming, and the porpoises coming, and the killer whales coming, and the walruses and our sea lions, and it gets pretty loud up there, and it's just, You could just hear it building. You can smell the ooligan coming, and it's just such a wonderful time. And it's so exciting back in the day when, you come in with your load of ooligan and the docks are full of such happy people waiting for their first fish of the year. I really miss that.
Cindy told me that starting in the 1990s, fewer and fewer ooligan returned each spring until the run completely collapsed in the mid-2000s. Authorities blamed local tribal communities, accusing them of overfishing. But Cindy knows better. In the 1990s, she watched as debris and silt drifted downriver from upriver operations, coinciding with the rise of industrial mining just across the Canadian border.
It's just so important for the people, because over the past almost 20 years now, almost a whole generation to us, our grandkids were involved, but our great-grandkids are too young, so they missed out. We've been held back so much because of, the ooligan aren't there, but the ooligan aren't there because the river isn't clean. And the river isn't clean because the mines are working. I think there was like maybe 9 years that all the mines were shut down because the price of gold was low and it wasn't worth it. And the ooligan started coming back. But now there's so many mines that have been given permission to explore and make roads and pollute our river that, they said there's not enough to catch. Well, there's not enough to catch because there's not enough clean water. In the 90s, we noticed, I couldn't understand, being way up the river, and it should be no pollution at all up there, no pallets and rusty old barrels and buckets and tarps. And I asked my husband, I said, how on earth would those get up this river? And he said, it's not getting up the river, it's coming down. And then we found out that a small mine had started, and that I think it worked for maybe 10, 15 years, and they just abandoned it. They left it. They used one lake, a natural pure lake, for their tailings dam. It rains 14 feet a year here in rainforest in Southeast Alaska. And of course, rain will fill up the lake and it will flood and leach out. And that's apparently what's happening up there, is why the ooligan stopped using that river. Ooligan are not tied to a river like salmon are. They go to where it's clean and cold. But salmon, unfortunately, they're tied to the river. And we're having less and less salmon on the banks in the fall when they should be full of carcasses from spawning out. But when we're up there in the moose hunting, there are no carcasses. There's no bears to come down for the salmon. All tied together. And I think we're losing this battle for the river from the mines in Canada.
The risks associated with mining on watersheds are well documented. Mining contributes to contamination in water and sediment. It impacts water cycling, physical habitat, and the health of many organisms. But Canada's mining regulations are insufficiently preventive and oversight is weak.
All these mines are directly upstream of our communities. And mines are an inherently destructive, depleting industry. Their only restriction is they are banned from creating unnecessary or undue degradation. But the mining companies themselves define what is necessary and allowable degradation. If that mine plan calls for a 2.5 mile wide, 1 mile deep open pit, or 4.8 billion tons of acid generating waste rock piled on the land, that is allowable under the current law and the current system. It's all allowable. The history of mining is replete. All mines degrade nearby surface waters. Almost all of them degrade their groundwaters. They routinely violate the conditions of their permit. And fining doesn't help them. In the last 18-year period, over $1 billion of fines were levied. And a recent audit showed that they didn't create any changes in the conditions. It's a cost of doing business. Mining and salmon just do not coexist. And then the EIS process, and I may be getting on here, but the process of approving these mines is highly flawed. It's all getting to a yes. It's a whole process getting to a yes. As long as the mine and the government can work out certain conditions, they're guaranteed a permit. There is no in the process. And they justify this all by doing, an environmental impact analysis. So they'll spend a lot of money, a lot of consultants, a lot of pages, a lot of studies trying to predict what the effects of this particular project are going to have on the environment and the social, economic factors of the surrounding communities from now basically until forever. And as it turns out, these environmental impact studies have zero predictive value. They never accurately portray what the outcomes tend to be. Again, they all end up, polluting surface water, even though they all said they weren't going to do that. As it turns out, the future is unknowable. And it reminds me of that old joke, how do you make God laugh? You tell her you have a plan. What looks good on paper doesn't necessarily look good out in the real world. Modern mines fail at a higher rate and more catastrophically than mines did even 50 years ago. It's because the grade of ore that they're exploiting has gone way down. All of the high grade ore was mined a long time ago. We talk about it was like mining the chocolate chips out of a chocolate chip cookie. Nowadays, you're mining the baking soda out of a chocolate chip cookie. So the mines have to go large. And anytime you get these super huge, complex mining operations trying to operate in unmeasurably complex ecosystems, it's impossible to predict the outcomes.
Oh, we've written so many letters to the commissioners, to the governors, to everyone concerned. We've been to so many meetings. People came over and were speaking about the possibility of a mine opening up on the Unuk River. And we tried to tell them, that's too small of a river. It won't survive any kind of a spill you have up there. You're not the only one on the river. You have to worry about your downriver neighbors. And the Unuk and the Stikine and the Taku are the main bread bowl for salmon in practically the whole world now, because everything else is farmed or the rivers are dammed and the fish can't get up. But we have 3 major wild rivers in Southeast Alaska, and every one of them is threatened with a mine in Canada. That's the sad part for me is I don't have any ooligan to make grease with to show my grandchildren. And you need quite a bit, but just within the last, I think it's 3 years now, we've been allowed to go 100 miles up, over the ocean and through the islands and to the Unuk River. And we are allowed 1 5-gallon bucket per household. It's not enough, even for our household. But we share as far as it'll go. We go through the elders, and my son would go to I guess he had a list of all of his old ladies that he would take care of with whatever he caught, and he'd make sure that they got enough, like 10 or 15 ooligan in a bag for a meal. But we spread those ooligan, that 1 5-gallon bucket of ooligan, so thin to as many people as we could share it with, because that's my husband's inherent duty to his clan, to take care of the river and to bring the ooligan home. And he takes it very seriously. He always has. He's a Tequidi Sanyakwan Brown Bear clan of Cape Fox. And his crest marks the mouth of the river, and according to Tlingit law, the crest is his deed to that river. And in the old ways, his people would be the only ones allowed to even catch and then bring it ooligan out to trade. And it just hurts him to it's that they've kind of opened it up to anyone who wants to go try to catch ooligan, and he's allowed 1 5-gallon bucket.
We noticed that up the Unuk River when the first Eskay Creek mine opened, that the hooligan population crashed. And then when they closed the mine, after a few years, the hooligan population started coming back. They've never come back to the levels they were, but they were coming back. And now they're reopening that mine again, even bigger. It's going from a little underground mine to an open pit mine. And we can, I presumably can expect the same result. But BC doesn't really care what happens on this side of the border. They call it a jurisdictional boundary, and they don't account for effects on the U.S. side of the border.
The Eskay Creek Revitalization Project, a proposed open-pit gold and silver mine built on the footprint of an old underground operation, sits deep in northwestern BC, about 250 kilometers from Stewart. Fast-tracked by provincial authorities, it secured its environmental assessment approval since January. The project is now at the center of a petition in the BC Supreme Court, which SCITC filed on behalf of more than a dozen Alaskan tribes in late 2025. They are challenging a BC cabinet order that explicitly barred these Alaskan-based tribes from acquiring participating Indigenous nation or PIN status. Without PIN status, these tribes are stripped of capacity funding, independent oversight, and deep consultation rights on industrial development along their shared watersheds. The petition builds on a landmark 2021 Supreme Court of Canada ruling. The court acknowledged that colonization displaced Indigenous peoples across borders and determined that Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes any modern-day successors of Indigenous societies that lived in Canadian territory at the time of European contact. This means that US-based tribes can hold the same substantive rights, such as hunting, fishing, and Aboriginal title, as well as procedural rights, such as consultation, as Canadian Indigenous groups. To make sense of what this fight means for transboundary rights, I spoke with John Gaylis, the lead attorney representing SCITC in the BC Supreme Court.
In April of 2021, there was a decision that came down from our Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Desautel. So in 1982, when the Constitution was repatriated to Canada, they inserted Section 35, which essentially guarantees certain Aboriginal and treaty rights under our Constitution. So these rights were common law rights before, but they became elevated to constitutional rights. So hunting, fishing, land-based rights, cultural, spiritual rights might all be covered under that. Self-government being another area. So in Desautel, the issue was whether or not a non-resident or non-citizen of Canada could still hold Section 35 Aboriginal rights. And the gentleman in that case, Mr. Desautel, was a member of a Colville tribe in Washington State, had come up across the border, shot a moose, reported himself to the wildlife officers and said, well, I have an Aboriginal right because I come from the Arrow Lakes tribe or Cynics, who Canada had actually declared extinct in around the 1950s. And so it went through all the levels of court, and the court said, yes, there is that possibility, and they acquitted him on the charges, finding that he wasn't, the language, the grammar is not great. It's Aboriginal people of Canada, Aboriginal person of Canada. And the court also made some comments about duty of consultation in that case, because the province and a number of other interveners, other provinces had raised this issue. So they said, well, if you give these guys rights, we're going to have to consult with all of these other nations, which we never planned on, that are resident in the US. And the court rejected that. And so that's kind of the basis for the SCITC's ask for consultation, is to say, we are essentially equivalent to Desautel in that we have rights in Canada that were never extinguished. One of the defining features in this case is that ethnographically, they already are Aboriginal peoples of Canada. They are Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. Like there's no dispute that those three groups are Aboriginal peoples of Canada. In fact, the two main consultation cases are Haida and Taku River Tlingit. And then Tsimshian, there's they're well known in terms of their being Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So that was kind of the genesis, I think, for the case. They had already actually asked for consultation even prior to Desautel under UNDRIP, the UN declaration, so free, prior, informed consent. And of course, there have been some recent cases that have considered that and how that fits in with duty to consult, including Gidhala out of the BC Court of Appeal, which the Supreme Court of Canada is now going to hear that appeal, and then another case from back east from the federal court. So we had intervened in Desautel for another U.S. resident tribe, Lummi Nation, who are just across the border in Washington State. Lummi's been on a similar odyssey to the SCITC, and independent of that, we started working with the Alaska tribes and SCITC on trying to get them consultation rights in Canada. And it's important that these are to understand that these are procedural rights. A right to be heard, I guess, would be how we might characterize them, as opposed to substantive rights. So they're not asking to hunt, to fish, to have land-based rights in Canada at this point, but they're saying, at the key dates, first contact or sovereignty, we were occupying lands in Canada, we were harvesting in Canada, and it's not that long ago when if you look at it in the broader sense, because the border wasn't really established until 1903 in the Alaska Panhandle, and even much later before there was really any enforcement. And I'm not sure to what extent there even is enforcement today, to be honest with you. So the argument was, we are Aboriginal peoples of Canada. We want to be consulted on these projects because they're going to impact not only our rights in the U.S., but our rights on the other side of that colonial border, that line, because that's what gives them a right to consultation, meaningful consultation, as opposed to, we're just updating you on what we're doing. Let us know if you have any concerns, and we'll end up ignoring those. So that was, that's kind of the reason why it's so important, is without that connection to BC, to Canada, they're not going to get anything meaningful in terms of responses from the Crown, because the duty that's on the Crown is not only to take in the information in terms of the harms that the nations might suffer, but also come up with a way to accommodate that. And that might mean not approving the project. That might mean a smaller project in a different location, or those are the sorts of things that we think about when we're talking about accommodations. I think that's why it's critical. And then when you look at the number of mining projects that are being either operating or contemplated in the territory on the three rivers, then you've got a real cumulative effects problem.
Following the Supreme Court of Canada's Desautel decision, SCITC formally applied on behalf of its member tribes for consultation in relation to projects in the transboundary watersheds that might adversely affect the tribe's rights with respect to traditional territory in British Columbia. In 2022, it also formally requested to be added as a participating Indigenous nation on the Eskay project.
So the BC Environmental Assessment Office said initially, after receiving the request for consultation, they said, well, this is the information we need to show that you're an Aboriginal peoples of Canada. There was some delay in terms of getting that information. This is not the sort of information that people are going to have at their fingertips, particularly given the amount of time that's elapsed. So initially, BC turned them down. They wrote a letter and said, we're denying you PIN status. And it's a really low threshold. It says under the Act, it's section 14.2, sub 2, which says there's no reasonable possibility that your rights will be impacted. So essentially everybody gets in if you're on the BC side of the border. So BC turned them down initially, but said, but we're willing to reconsider if you'll give us more information on this. And so rather than filing a petition, which they could have done at that point, but the challenge was they didn't have any evidence because they hadn't, put forward the evidence that BC had asked for. They decided to go away and get that evidence and make that submissions.
For over 13 months, the tribe spent limited community resources assembling extensive ethnographic, oral history, and traditional knowledge evidence, including elder testimonies, clan lineage records, and oral history mapping. They submitted those materials in late January of 2024 to reopen the review.
And then instead of actually responding to that, BC passed it's called an order in council. So it was essentially an executive order by the provincial cabinet, which said you're not eligible for PIN status on these 6 projects, I think it was. So at that point, the tribes decided that they wanted to challenge that. And there were 3 grounds. One was that what they had actually done, the statute that they were relying upon, was not intended to be used for that purpose. So the term is ultra virus. We said what you've done is illegal. You cannot do this. And then there was like what we call an administrative law ground, which was what's called legitimate expectations, which means, once you agree on a particular process for a hearing, which is essentially what this is, even though it's done in writing, you have to follow through on that process. So the tribes went off, using their limited resources to put in this submission, and there was a duty on the Environmental Assessment Office to review it, to discuss it if they needed to actually render a decision. But rather than render a decision, the federal cabinet, put their thumb on the scale. The provincial cabinet, it's all provincial. They put their thumb on the scale and passed the order in council. So that leads up to the petition, and then subsequently, the province decided, after reviewing the petition, I think it was pretty clear to them that they were going to lose. So they decided to change the legislation.
In April, BC passed amendments to the Environmental Assessment Act that formally prohibit U.S. tribes from acquiring participating Indigenous nation status. Critics argued this effectively walls off cross-border nations from BC's oversight process, stripping them of the procedural tools needed to protect their shared watersheds.
I would say the government was so certain that they were going to lose at the Supreme Court that now they've since just gone around the court and they changed the law. Under the Environmental Assessment Act, Aboriginal people of Canada, which the U.S. tribes are now considered as protected under Section 35 as Aboriginal people of Canada, or the same Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian people here as that are on that side of the border. Before, as long as you fell under Section 35, you were eligible for consultation somewhere on the spectrum. What BC did, though, was they changed the law to specifically exclude non-resident tribes from participating Indigenous nation status, regardless of their strength of claim, regardless of the level of harm, just indiscriminately. So now we have people, same nations, but under 2 different sets of rights, a diminished set of rights and a full set of rights. And it's not part of the lawsuit, but in my head, if you can deny a certain group of people basic rights, then nobody really has basic rights. These are inherent rights. They shouldn't be bestowed upon or taken away. They're inherent. But this is the setup. BC is going down, and I would say again, because that determination that certain sets of human beings are only afforded a certain set of rights, that's the same philosophy that led to forced removal from the lands and boarding schools. Here they go again.
So that happened, and then the next day after we'd given notice that they were going to amend the act, we got the Eskay approval. So the Eskay Creek environmental assessment certificate was issued. So it's required us to kind of refocus the litigation towards Eskay. But everything in terms of the process under that led to the Eskay certificate was all this, notification, and while the order in council was still in place. So they didn't get PIN status at any point, and were given a lesser level of consultation than BC-based First Nations. And we say that that's discriminatory, number one, but that given that they had put in all of this information, which does show their connection, we think there's a strong case there.
If we win, the remedy would be to throw out the order denying us our rights, give us the participating Indigenous nation rights on the Eskay Creek mine that we filed under, and any other watershed where we can show traditional use and occupation. Allow us to set up our own environmental process so that we can determine what does consent mean to the tribes, government to government, and allow us, our tribes have experienced, professional, dedicated environmental and land managing staff. Our knowledge needs to be part of this process. You can't come to the idea that these huge mines are going to protect a watershed when you've effectively cut the watershed in half and you're completely blind to the other side of the watershed. The salmon, the water, the wildlife, none of those things respect that border. We need to have that say in there. We need to be sure our say is listened to and enforced. If these mines are going to go forward and protect anything, these global values, you need to include us.
I'm hoping that they'll at least listen. We've asked for a seat at the table so we can express our worries and our fears, and they're acting like we want to vote, and we want to become a permanent part of that table, and we just want our voices heard, our concerns heard, because like I said, those are the last 3 wild rivers on every single coast on this continent for wild salmon. And one mistake, like Mount Polly on the Unuk River, is such a small little river. The Taku is much bigger and the Stikine is much bigger, but it's just going to wipe them out. And I don't know what we're going to do. There's no place else to go for us for salmon or ooligan. I'm sure they know what's at stake. They've heard it from us for over 20 years. Each time we go to deal with Canada, it's another prime minister, it's another bunch of people in the fisheries department, and they don't know what we're even talking about. There's no consistency in their government. And apparently they don't know their own people eat ooligan. I have family in Prince Rupert, where my grandfather emigrated to Metlakatla from in the 1880s. We still have people there, and they can get ooligan. So I was once the grease lady, and my husband was the ooligan man. And now we try to buy grease in Canada because we still eat it. A lot of people do. But I'm worried, too, that if it ever came back, that the young ones won't know how to eat it. But it is a delicacy. It's just the best. I've always eaten it. My husband always ate it. So we do pretty good with grief.
Species, nature, I'd say nature, is very, very resilient to the occasional one-off hard impact. The reason we have 5 species of salmon is because all the volcanoes and geology that goes on here, very active geology. It creates diversity. You break a bone, it comes back stronger. You stress a muscle, it comes back bigger. Nature is very good at responding to the one-off impact, but nature is very bad at responding to continuous low-level stress. We know what that does to our immune system, our nervous system, our digestive system. An aquatic ecosystem is exactly the same way. So when they say, oh, it's just a little mine and there's a mine here and they're way out of sight. And I don't want to overemphasize the catastrophic impacts, the catastrophic events. They will happen eventually, given perpetuity. But in the meantime, I worry more about the drip, drip, drip of low-level stress we're putting on this region. It is not sustainable, and we need to be aware of that.
Thank you for listening. The Climate Core Voices is now also available on Substack. If you're looking for more behind the scenes and stories from Climate Court, you can check out my new Substack newsletter, The Climate Record. Link is in the show notes.